Russia has been ramping up its attacks on infrastructure facilities across Ukraine, including in the capital Kyiv, where hundreds of thousands were without power or water for hours as a result this week. Russian forces are also targeting regions to the east and south, and Ukrainian officials say fighting is intense on the front lines in the far eastern city of Donetsk. But despite all that, Russian President Vladimir Putin declared yesterday that the government was going to stop enlisting new fighters. That draft process sparked rare signs of resistance in Russia, with protests and many military-age men leaving the country. And a small minority of Russians are still openly opposing the war in general, despite the very real possibility of imprisonment for speaking out.
За слова «нет войне», они у нас считаются экстремизмом. Тебя могут посадить на 10-15 лет в тюрьму. Это хорошо объясняет то, почему сотни тысяч, например, не выходят на протест. Всех, кто не согласен, у нас избивают, арестовывают, сажают в тюрьму, пытают и так далее.
Those brave resistors are the subjects of the latest Frontline documentary, Putin's War at Home, which premieres tonight on PBS. I'm joined by the film's producer and director, Gesbeen Mohammad. Gesbeen, it's a pleasure to have you, and congratulations on the film.
Thank you for having us.
Were you surprised that people like those you profile in the film, a professor, journalists, ordinary people, were willing to say what they were willing to say on camera?
Yes. I mean, as soon as we started making this film, it was very apparent that the atmosphere of sort of fear had grown so much in Russia, and that it would be very difficult to get people to talk about their opposition to the war on camera. We were lucky to find these individuals who are extremely brave for taking part in this film.
And by the way, they know exactly what they're facing. Here's a little back and forth with the two journalists you profile, Olga and Galena. Here they are.
Понимаете ли вы, что вы потенциально рискуете уголовным наказанием на срок от 8 до 15 лет за распространение недостоверной информации о российских вооруженных силах, также за сотрудничество с иностранными медиа?
Я понимаю, что потенциально я могу быть наказана.
Я понимаю, что могу быть наказана.
Заняв такую позицию, в принципе, мы можем, наверное, сломать себе всю жизнь.
Could you describe what those two journalists were doing?
Olga and Yelena are two very, very brave journalists who go around Siberia and investigate Russian fighters who have died in the war in Ukraine. Now Putin has obviously declared that a state secret. So what they're doing is essentially defying the orders that Putin has laid down since the war in Ukraine.
And it's motivated by the fact that they believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, they believe that if the Russian public knew how intense the casualties were, that their support for this war would start to disappear. Is that not correct?
Precisely. So what they say in the documentary is that essentially the Russian state is trying to convey to Russians that there are no consequences for Russians in terms of this war. But in fact, they say the war has entered every Russian's home already.
And we should be clear, this is not just dangerous what they are doing. These are crimes under new Russian laws that are punishable with very serious consequences.
Yes, absolutely. So after the war started, Russians took to the streets, and within 10 days, Putin effectively criminalized opposing the war and independently reporting on it.
You know, some of the scenes, Sonia, who we just saw a couple of minutes ago, her partner, Sasha, has been imprisoned. And some of the most touching scenes, the support for people who go to the courthouse, the heart shape that Sasha makes with her hand while she's in this cage in the courtroom. But please share with people, if you would, what's the crime for which she is in the midst of being punished? What has she done that offends the Russian state?
Well, Sasha, being an artist and someone who had protested when the war started, and when it became impossible to protest, she decided to replace supermarket stickers with stickers that essentially contained information about what was happening in Ukraine. And obviously to us, this is very sort of innocuous, but she's now facing up to 10 years in prison for this sort of act of defiance.
You know, one of the things that was most amazing to me is the unimaginable courage of the people you spoke to, and I know they're not the only ones, obviously. But one of the most painful parts to me was Natalia, who has done this remarkable work on TikTok, and the professor, whose name I forget for a moment, whose parents are still in Ukraine. They're not just dealing with Putin, they're dealing with their own families. Correct me if I'm wrong, Natalia's mother and the professor's 13-year-old daughter, as of the moment, are buying the Putin line and combating their own, in one case, kid, in another case, parent with this crap. Are they not?
Yes, I mean, I guess because of the sort of increasing censorship and propaganda inside Russia, families are really being torn apart because some Russians don't have any exposure to Western media. And so the ones that essentially only get fed state media end up believing essentially the propaganda that Russia is disseminating. And that's really tearing families apart.
Do you have any idea? I mean, I think we're 9 months in. I hope I have the count right, but it's been a really long time. Do you have any idea as to whether or not this resistance is growing? I'm assuming, as I said at the top of this, that Putin would not be backing off this recruitment thing where they were picking up men off the street who were busking or sitting outside at a cafe. He wouldn't be backing off that if he wasn't getting blowback. Is the movement growing as best you can tell?
Well, based on what we sort of gathered on the ground, it seemed that when Putin announced mobilization on the 21st of September, many people took to the streets and mothers came out, wives came out in support of their husbands. They didn't want their men to be called up to fight in Ukraine. That has slowly died down. What we've seen is obviously a response from Russia, but what we've seen is also the tightening of screws. Again, people are too afraid to go out and publicly oppose the war because of the heavy sentencing that they might be exposed to.
So do you, other than I mentioned a minute ago, and anybody who sees the film will feel the same way, the incredible courage of ordinary people, and I don't mean ordinary in a pejorative way, I mean just average people who have a commitment to something that really matters. Other than the courage, is there a common thread, do you think, among all the people who you profile?
I think all of them, I mean, obviously there is bravery, but all of them had this sense of injustice that obviously in relation to the war in Ukraine, but not also in relation to themselves. Their rights have been taken away from them. There is no freedom of speech left for them in Russia. They can't express themselves freely. So I guess Putin's war at home really was a way for them to take back their voices. They have no other platforms to really express themselves.
You know, I know you've done a lot of films where you've gone inside countries that were impenetrable to most journalists. Do you pause for a minute when you're either making a film like this or in between and think about what separates? I mean, there are a lot of people, I'm sure, who share the feelings of the handful of people you profile in this film. Do you think about what separates those of us who have the courage to act, which I'm not sure I would have, from those who just harbor it inside and can't bring themselves to do it?
That's a really difficult one to answer, but it's a good question. I think every authoritarian society has people who are willing to essentially fight, obviously peacefully, for what they believe in. And I think it's often people who have had a lot taken away from them. And for example, Sonia, her partner, has been taken away from her. Roman, he's separated from his family. He doesn't know when he's going to be able to see his parents ever again. And so I think they've gotten to a point where there isn't, I suppose, much to lose. They want to be able to live just the way you and I live here in the West.
Well, all I can say is your film is terrific and important, and I urge everybody watching to watch it later tonight. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Gesbeen Mohammad's film for Frontline, Putin's War at Home, premieres here on GBH2 and on the PBS YouTube page tonight at 10. It's also streaming now at pbs.org and in the PBS video app.